The last time anyone saw Elena Mireles alive, the sky above Gardena, Nevada, was the color of dishwater, neither day nor night, just that tired in-between. They remember her front porch light glowing at an hour it was usually dark, remember her car parked at an angle that suggested a hurried arrival or a half-decided departure. They remember music drifting from her living room, a slow piano piece that did not belong to any record she owned. They remember all this with conviction, and yet none of it is written down. What is written down looks clean, almost harmless. Female 27, found in her small rented house on Willow Lane. Time of discovery, 7:42 a.m. Cause of passing, undetermined. On paper, the details feel distant, as if they belong to some other woman from some other town. But in the memory of those who loved her, and those who only claim they did, Elena remains close, hovering like a note left unresolved. She moved to Gardena 3 years earlier in 1982, taking a position as the elementary school's music teacher. A small woman with dark, wavy hair and quick, attentive eyes, she carried herself as if she were always listening. To the rustle of children's impatience, to the sigh of the wind against the playground swings, to something private beating beneath it all. Born in Las Cruces, raised by a mother who worked double shifts in a diner, Elena had learned early that quiet could hold more meaning than noise. The morning they found her, she was lying on the worn carpet between her couch and the coffee table, one arm tucked beneath her as if she'd only tripped on her way to stand up. There were no broken objects, no scattered photographs, no signs of a struggle. A glass stood upright on the table, half full. The front door was closed but not locked. Her bed was made. It was, in a way that disturbed people precisely because of its normalcy, an ordinary room with an extraordinary absence. Some said Elena had seemed tired lately, thinner, the gentle brightness in her voice dulled around the edges. Others swore she'd been fine, humming under her breath while walking home from school, waving at neighbors, promising a new spring concert with her students. A few insisted they'd heard raised voices from her house one evening, though when asked to describe the voice that wasn't hers, male or female, young or old, their answers drifted apart like smoke. Back then in 1985, the town understood the world in simpler terms, at least on the surface. If someone left, they'd meant to leave. If someone stayed, it was because they belonged. If someone's life ended suddenly and quietly in their own living room, there had to be a reason that fit neatly into a box. Sorrow turned inward or harm from outside. A choice or an act. Anything but the stubborn uncertainty that Elena left them with. The coroner's report, thin and reluctant, offered little comfort. No clear physical harm, no unmistakable signs of poisoning. A suggestion of stress on the heart, but nothing conclusive. Possible self-inflicted passing cannot be ruled out, stood beside. Foul play cannot be excluded, like two strangers pretending to know one another. The town did not know what to do with that kind of indecision, so it chose a story, individually, in private. Some chose to believe that Elena had made a quiet choice, the kind that could not be discussed out loud without inviting unbearable questions. Others believed just as firmly that someone had been with her that night, someone whose presence never made it into the reports, someone who had left through the back door and disappeared into the fading light. A few changed their minds every year, depending on what else in their lives felt unstable. In those early days, the investigation was brief, dutiful, and careful not to stare too long into the space where answers should have been. Officers spoke to neighbors, colleagues, a distant cousin who drove in from Reno. They stood in Elena's house, hoping that the room would give them something. An echo, a feeling, a single detail that stood out as wrong. But everything looked stubbornly ordinary. The lead investigator then was a man named Harlan Cross, steady and pragmatic, who'd been with the county sheriff's office longer than Elena had been alive. He wrote his notes in square, cramped letters, never allowing personal impressions to spill onto official paper. Still, once, in the margin of a page that would never be part of the formal file, he wrote a single line to himself. "Feels close, like someone almost spoke and then didn't." The file was eventually labeled undetermined. Not solved, not closed, just placed into the quiet archive of the county building, where dust would be kinder than speculation. Years slipped past. Children who had once sung off-key in Elena's classroom grew up and left Gardena or stayed and became their parents. The house on Willow Lane was rented out again, and then again, to people who never knew why the carpet was newer in one patch of the living room. Elena's memory settled into the town like a faint watermark, visible only when held against the light in a certain way. In the private corners of their minds, some still replayed the night before she passed, inventing or altering memories to soothe themselves. A neighbor would tell herself, decades later, that she had definitely seen Elena smiling that day, even if she couldn't remember at what hour or from what angle. A coworker would swear that Elena had once confided a fear, though the words themselves slipped away whenever she tried to grasp them. In the middle of all these fragile, shifting recollections sat the simple, unchanging fact. A woman who had not seemed ready to leave this world had somehow done so, or been helped, or pushed, or simply let go in a way no one around her could comprehend. The town lived with that ambiguity, not comfortably but steadily, until it learned to pretend it had forgotten. Files waited, papers faded, stories simplified themselves. The porch light on Willow Lane was replaced with a more modern fixture. The piano in the school salon was tuned and retuned. And somewhere beneath all that ordinary time, the shape of Elena's last night remained, unsteady, incomplete, and aching for another set of eyes. 2. A forgotten witness or document reopens the cold investigation. When the case came back to life, it didn't arrive with sirens or headlines. It came in the form of a tired clerk, a misfiled folder, and a line of handwriting that refused to be ignored. It was late autumn, nearly 4 decades after Elena's passing, when an intern in the county records office was asked to clear a storage room. The room was small and windowless, filled with boxes that had not been touched in years. On the side of one carton in fatting marker were the words, "Gardena Inactive Cases, 1980–1986. The intern dragged the box out, sneezed at the dust, and began sorting. It should have been a routine task, shifting forgotten stories into newer folders, cataloging them, making space. Instead, halfway through, a thin manila envelope slipped free, unlabeled, held closed by a rusted paperclip. Inside lay a single sheet of lined paper, folded twice. The handwriting was hesitant, with letters that leaned in uncertain directions. "I need to say that I saw someone at Miss Mireles' house the night before she passed. I was scared to say anything before. I still am. I don't want trouble, but I can't stop remembering." No name, no date, only a partial address at the top, Willow Lane, and a single initial at the bottom, J. The intern, not knowing who Miss Mireles was, placed the sheet aside, intending to ask a supervisor whether it needed to be refiled somewhere specific. But the county building had its own way of suspending small decisions. The note sat on a cluttered desk for 2 days. On the third, it caught the eye of someone who recognized the name. Detective Caleb Ross was not old enough to have worked the original investigation. He had been 9 years old in 1985, living in another county entirely, when the news of Elena's passing barely made a whisper outside Gardena. But he'd grown up in Nevada, and he knew the way towns carried their unsolved moments like quiet aches. When the clerk walked over to his desk, envelope in hand, and mentioned a teacher on Willow Lane, he felt a small, reluctant curiosity stir. He could have let it go, he knew that. The note was anonymous, unstable, possibly the product of a late conscience or a wandering memory. But the way the words were written, the admission of fear, the insistence on an image that would not fade pulled at something in him. He had spent enough years listening to people explain themselves in interrogation rooms to know that the things they could not forget often pointed more reliably toward the heart of events than the things they claimed to remember clearly. He asked for the old file. It arrived on his desk in a cardboard box softened by time. He removed the lid with something like hesitation, aware that reopening old pain did not guarantee relief for anyone. Inside were yellowing reports, photographs so faded that the edges blurred into the background, and the formal, careful language of an earlier era of policing. Reading through the original investigation, Caleb felt an odd sense of proximity to the woman he had never met. The way colleagues described her, patient with shy students, soft-spoken but firm. The way neighbors talked around her rather than about her, as if reluctant to claim they had really known her. The way the coroner's report seemed to hold its breath instead of taking a stance. He found a small photograph tucked into the back of the file, a staff picture from the elementary school. Elena stood in the second row, not centered, not highlighted, her hair curling around her face. She was mid-blink, eyes half closed, as if caught between expressions. The others in the picture smiled directly at the camera. She seemed to be listening to something just outside the frame. The anonymous note sat beside the photo on his desk. A witness, or someone who believed themselves to be, had carried a memory for decades. Who was Jay? Why confess now? Was the memory reliable or reshaped by the gentle erosion of time? His supervisor raised an eyebrow when Caleb brought it up. An unsigned note from a box we were about to send to long-term storage, she said. You think that's enough to justify revisiting a case this old? I don't know if it justifies anything, Caleb replied. But someone thought it mattered enough to write. So either it's a false echo or it's the only honest thing in this file. She watched him for a moment, assessing something she didn't name. You realize if you go down this path, you might not find anything but more uncertainty. He considered that. It wasn't a warning so much as a prediction. Maybe, but the uncertainty is still here whether we look at it or not. Silence stretched between them, the kind that settles when two people understand the cost of asking questions. At last she nodded. Fine, you can take a preliminary look, but keep it quiet. No promises to anyone, no expectations. Caleb understood. He'd never been much for grand outcomes anyway. His work over the years had taught him that the human heart rarely moved in straight lines. Justice, when it appeared at all, arrived late and incomplete. He began where the note pointed. The night before Elena's passing, the view from Willow Lane. He visited the street alone, standing outside the house that had once been hers. The paint was a different color now, the front lawn more patchwork than grass, but the shape of the place remained. He imagined a younger, unnamed Jay watching from a nearby window or sidewalk, seeing someone approach Elena's front door. The memory would have anchored itself not just in sight, but in feeling, unease, confusion, perhaps admiration or envy. Something that gave the image weight. Inside the old file, he found mention of a teenager living 2 doors down at the time, someone who'd been briefly interviewed. The record of that interview was strangely thin. A name, Jonah, then 16, and a single line. Did not see or hear anything unusual. Caleb stared at that sentence. The neat handwriting from 1985 seemed almost too sure of itself, too tidy for a boy who might have looked out a window at the wrong moment, and then spent years wondering whether he should have said something. Jay, he thought, Jonah maybe. The possibility was not proof. It wasn't even a strong lead. But it was something, and in a case built on absence, even a fragile maybe carried weight. He read the note again, paying attention not to the claim, but to the emotion embedded in the words. I still am. I don't want trouble, but I can't stop remembering. There it was, an internal struggle carried quietly across decades. Whoever had written this wasn't trying to impress or manipulate. They were trying to manage their own conscience. That, more than the detail of seeing someone, made Caleb believe the note was rooted in something real. He picked up the phone and began tracing names, addresses, and old-school records, following the faint impressions of a life that had slipped into history. Not because he believed he would find a clean answer. Because someone had once stood on this street, watching Elena's porch light glow against the dusk, and had carried that image through the long years between then and now. Because silence, he knew, did not erase responsibility. It only buried it. And because, as he looked at Elena's photograph, he could not shake the feeling that her story had never been allowed to finish its own sentence. 3. Investigator focuses on human psychology more than physical clues. Caleb did not begin with lab tests or new forensic angles. There was little point. The physical traces, if any had ever been there, were long gone. The carpet in Elena's living room had been replaced. The glass from that final night had been washed, reused, discarded. Air had moved through the rooms, carrying away whatever scent or temperature might once have lingered. What remained was people, and the ways they had folded the past into themselves. He started with quiet conversations, not formal interviews. He'd learned over the years that when you put someone in a chair under a bright light and called it questioning, they performed a version of themselves. The innocent neighbor, the grieving friend, the concerned relative. He wasn't interested in their performances. He wanted the moments in between. The first person he visited was the former school principal, now retired, who had worked closely with Elena. Her name was Ruth Sims. Her hands trembled slightly when she poured tea, but her gaze was sharp, as if time had only thinned her body, not her attention. "You're very late," she said when he mentioned Elena. Not accusatory exactly, just stating a fact. "I am," Caleb agreed. "I know this is unexpected. I'm not here to make promises. I'm just trying to understand what happened around her." Ruth watched him for a long beat, as if testing whether he would fill the silence with eager assurances. When he didn't, she relaxed a fraction. "She was kind," Ruth said. "You've probably read that in the reports, but that word is too simple. She was careful with people. She saw them. Children especially. The ones who hadn't yet learned how to hide what they felt." "You said was," Caleb replied gently. "What else was she beneath that?" Ruth's fingers tightened around her cup. "Sometimes I thought she carried a weight that wasn't visible. Not sadness exactly, but a watchfulness. As if she was measuring every moment, asking herself whether she was doing enough. She wanted to make everything softer for the children. That kind of wanting doesn't come for free." He studied her face. Did she speak about her life outside school? Friends, family, anyone close? A brief hesitation, a glance toward the window. Not much. She mentioned a cousin in Reno, a mother who'd already left this world by then, a few acquaintances. But Elena kept her personal life very gently sealed, not in a secretive way, more as if she didn't want to burden anyone with it. "Did you ever worry about her?" "Yes," Ruth said without pause. Her voice, however, took its time. "But I told myself the worry was my own, that she was just quiet, that not everyone who carries an invisible weight is in danger." There, in that tiny admission, Caleb heard an echo of something familiar. The way people negotiate with their consciences by declaring their involvement limited. I saw something, but I told myself it wasn't what I thought. I heard something, but I decided I misunderstood. "Do you believe she chose to leave?" he asked, finally putting into words the question the file had circled around for years. Ruth's eyes met his, and in them he saw neither certainty nor the relief of a fixed story. He saw conflict. "I used to think no," she said slowly. "Then for a while I convinced myself yes. It made it easier in a strange way to believe it was her decision, even if I didn't understand it. But whenever I try to truly settle on an answer, I hear her laugh in the hallway, see her hands on the piano keys, and I feel unfinished, as if the story I chose for her doesn't quite fit." "What about the idea that someone was with her that night?" he pressed gently. Again that flicker in her gaze. "There were rumors, whispers about a visitor, a friend, someone dropping by after dark. Nothing solid. And after a while you learn to live with not knowing. You file it away. You focus on the children who are still here." He thanked her and left with more questions than he'd brought. But that was, he reminded himself, a kind of progress. Next he found Jonah. The boy who had once lived 2 doors down was now a man in his 50s, with lines around his eyes that looked less like age and more like long-term tension. He worked at an auto shop in a town half an hour away, standing beneath raised cars all day, listening to the steady, impersonal hum of machinery. When Caleb introduced himself and mentioned Elena, Jonah's shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly. "I already talked to the police back then," Jonah said, wiping his hands on a cloth. "I told them I didn't see anything." Caleb nodded. "I've read that. I'm wondering about what you remembered afterward." A small muscle in Jonah's jaw worked as he stared at the ground. The line between admission and denial seemed to flicker behind his eyes. "I don't want trouble," he murmured. "That line is familiar," Caleb said quietly. "Whoever wrote the note said the same thing." Jonah's gaze snapped up, and in that startled pause, Caleb had his answer even before the man spoke. I was young," Jonah said finally. 16. I thought if I said I saw someone, they'd pull me in, blame me, or drag me